I'm Robin, and this is the Two-Headed Monster.
Hello!
And we're here to tell you all about the word conflict.
Conflict!
Right, conflict. You guys ready to show conflict?
Ready!
Okay, here we go. The Two-Headed Monster showing us conflict.
Pajabalena chiki kosowo. O iketebo odamado.
Time out, guys. I'm not sure you understand. We need to show everyone conflict.
Conflict!
Right, but I'm afraid that wasn't conflict.
No conflict.
No, you see, a conflict is when two people fight or disagree about something, and they have a conflict.
Oh, conflict! Yeah.
Okay, great.
Conflict.
We're ready to try again? Okay, here we go. The Two-Headed Monster is now going to show us conflict. Take two.
What is it, you? Man.
Whatever has a flower, he says, is his. That's a promising start.
Ikiboda odamada. Man.
Looks like the other one wants the same flower. This could be some conflict.
Pajabalekabo. Share? Oh,
they're sharing.
Stop.
Look, that was very nice. That was lovely, actually. You were sharing, and that warms the cockles of my heart. But listen, my fuzzy two-headed friend, that was not conflict.
No conflict.
No conflict.
Conflict.
I'm just sorry, it wasn't. Conflict. Wait! I just realized something.
What?
We disagree. We're arguing about something.
So?
We're having a conflict.
Conflict?
Conflict.
Conflict!
Well, welcome to Conservation Corps North Bay Training Module number 5, Conflict Resolution, and this is part 1. And welcome. Since you're viewing the video on conflict resolution, you should have the Training Module 5 worksheet, part 1, conflict resolution, in front of you, so you can use it as we go along. Now, I've say this at the beginning of every video, but the module worksheets are really an important part of the training, and they're intended to serve as an outline for the training and the particular session that you're looking at. They contain several questions and prompts that require you to write, and I realize that writing may not be everyone's favorite task, but this really gives you an opportunity to engage the material at a deeper level and in a more thoughtful way, and it allows you to share your unique perspectives or your takes on things. Now, the worksheets are not intended in any way to be a test or an exam to see how well you understood the material. Actually, there are really no right or wrong answers to any of the prompts that you're asked to respond to in writing. And you're not graded or you're not judged on any of your responses. Your reactions are intended to extend your thinking and to give you an opportunity to sort of delve deeper into the material. When you complete this module on conflict resolution, part 1, at some time, I would really encourage you to share your written responses with a colleague, a supervisor, at a staff meeting, whatever. But I think to get your ideas, to let other people experience your ideas and to be able to give feedback and react to them is like a really important part of the process. Okay, well, let's go on. Now, in Module 3, we talked about what is called the behavior change continuum, and the 3 unique philosophical positions along the continuum. And they're represented on the screen here. And also, if you viewed module number 3, then you should have taken the behavior change survey. And you should have an idea of what your philosophical position on how change and learning takes place. So let's just briefly review these positions. And this is really important information for you to know about yourself because it informs you of your natural tendency towards interacting with others when you're in a teaching or supervisory role. So the first position is the position which is referred to as the internal, position, and it's depicted on the left side here. And this position views change as coming about due to an inner unfolding of the individual's potential. In other words, change comes about in someone from the inner unfolding of their natural potential. Now, the role of the supervisor who takes this philosophical stance is that of building strong, positive relationships that will facilitate the inner unfolding of the individual. So change actually comes about from within the person themselves, and the role of the supervisor is a facilitator, using acceptance, empathy, scaffolding, active listening, all relationship building strategies. The second position, depicted on the right side and referred to as the external, and this position views change as coming about by the quality and quantity of the stimulation from the external environment. In other words, external reinforcers that come. And the role of the supervisor, who has this philosophical position, is that of establishing the rules and rewards and punishments, and by using selective reinforcement strategies. So someone who views change or learning coming about by external stimulation would assume sort of this position. And the third, or the middle position, is the interactive position. And this position views change coming about through the interaction of internal and external forces working together on the individual. And the role of the supervisor here is to clarify, to set boundaries, to confront, to problem solve, to establish contracts and action plans, facilitate goal setting. And there is an emphasis here not so much on external reinforcements or positive or negative consequences, but the emphasis here is on logical or natural consequences. So these are the three philosophical positions. And here are the philosophical positions are represented, and all of the intervention strategies, all of these strategies that go under each of these, that go with each of these philosophical positions. Now, also in Module 3, we discussed the distinction between a technician and being a professional. And so the Tesla auto technician will be able to service or fix any Tesla you give her. But if you bring her your 1978 Honda 700cc motorcycle, she probably would be at a total loss as to what to do. So technicians are experts in their particular area or their particular field. On the other hand, the professional has access to many intervention strategies, and given any specific situation and a specific individual, is able to assess what the issue is, select from the entire toolbox, the appropriate intervention strategies. The metaphor that I look at it is an artist who has a palette of colors. And the artist can create any kind of mood that they want in the picture that they're going to paint, because they know exactly how to use all of the different colors to create different effects. So in previous modules, we presented some of the intervention strategies in our toolbox. Module 2 presented the Johari window, which is a way of increasing our communication ability. Module 4 presented the concept of active listening and paraphrasing and non-direct talk. These are all intervention strategies that fall under the relationship listening or the internal position. Now this module will address 3 more strategies from the toolbox. Identifying and resolving discipline problems, and that's sort of under this middle position. The concepts of spheres of influence, and that's a strategy that's under the internal position, and also the concept of I messages or I statements, which also is under the internal position. So we're going to begin then with the discipline issues. So we're going to take a look at several ways to deal with potential conflict and look at some of the cognitive, behavioral, and internal strategies that may help to prevent or redirect a situation in a positive way. Now, for our purposes, conflict may be defined as a collision between a supervisor's behavior and the client's behaviors, where their behaviors interfere with each other's attainment of their specific needs or goals or tasks or whatever. And in many cases, it becomes a discipline issue. So we'll discuss what constitutes discipline issues, and we'll practice identifying them. But first of all, let's take a look at what constitutes discipline issues. Discipline issues may arise when a person's behavior, whether it's a supervisor, a corps member, or anyone that you may be having an issue with, when the person's behavior interferes with the right of another person to work, learn, accomplish a task, etc. Also, a discipline issue arises when a person's behavior interferes with the right of the teacher, supervisor, counselor to teach, to do their job, to supervise. Also, discipline issues arise when a person's behavior is physically or psychologically unsafe and threatening to others, or we have discipline issues when property is destroyed. And of course, discipline issues are best addressed in a positive, constructive manner that does not escalate an issue. Okay, so we're going to have an exercise. Now, this exercise appears on pages 4, 5, and 6 in your worksheet. So you're going to want to be able to go to pages 4, 5, and 6 in your worksheet. And we'll be focusing on presenting a possible conflict or discipline situation and asking you to evaluate it in terms of, is there in fact a problem? If so, who's exhibiting the problem? And what, if any, is the disruptive behavior? So we're going to ask you to consider each of these. You're going to have 5 that you're going to look at. This is the first one. And here's the scenario. Corps members enter the Career Pathways classroom and take their seats. The Career Pathways counselor asks the Corps members to take out their resumes they have been developing. The counselor notices that Jackson has not taken out his resume, but is texting on his phone. The counselor decides to ignore Jackson and begins to involve the group in reviewing their resumes. Now on pages 4, 5, and 6, there'll be the 5 scenarios. The first one will be on page 4 at the top. So when I ask you to, I want you to stop the video, and you're going to go to pages 4, 5, and 6, and you're going to complete the 5 scenarios by responding to, is there a problem? If so, who's exhibiting the problem? And what, if any, is the disruptive behavior? When you have completed responding to all 5, I want you to turn the video back on, and then we'll look at some suggested responses for each of these. So please put the video on pause now, and go ahead and go to pages 4, 5, and 6 and complete the responses, then turn the video back on. Okay, go ahead. Okay, well, I'm assuming that you have completed your responses. So let's take a look at this first scenario. This is the one where Jackson has not taken out his resume when the counselor asks him, but he's texting on his phone. Is there a discipline problem here? If so, who's exhibiting the problem? What, if any, is the disruptive behavior? Well, a suggested response that there is no discipline problem. Jackson is not interfering with the rights of the counselor to teach or the other corps members to engage and to learn. So there's no harm here. Jackson, the same thing, he doesn't take his resume out, and he's texting on his phone. And the counselor begins to involve the class in reviewing their resumes. As the review is taking place, the counselor or teacher stands next to Jackson and continues to involve the class in their review. So again, the question is there a discipline problem here? If so, who's exhibiting the problem? What, if any, is the disruptive behavior? And the suggested response here, again, these are suggested responses. There is no discipline problem here. The counselor has chosen a management strategy that doesn't disturb others and at the same time increases the likelihood that Jackson will get on task. And actually the strategy that the counselor uses is proximity. By moving closer to the person may be encouraged to get back on task again. All right, let's look at the third scenario. Okay, the counselor notices this time that Jackson has not taken out his resume, but is texting on his phone. The counselor stops the review, continues to stand in front of the class and says, Jackson, put your phone away and get out your resume. We're not going to continue until you do so. Again, is there a discipline problem here? If so, who's exhibiting the problem? And what, if any, is the disruptive behavior? Well, the suggested response, and again, it's just a suggested response, is the counselor is exhibiting the discipline problem. Jackson's behavior is not interfering with the counselor's right to teach or the student's right to learn. So Jackson is not really presenting any discipline behavior. He's not going along with following the instructions, but he's not presenting a discipline problem because he's not interfering with any activities that are going on. Let's take a look at scenario number 4. Okay, core members enter the career pathways, yada, yada. The pathways counselor asks the core members to take out the resumes that they've been developing. Instead, Jackson takes out earphones and starts listening and singing loudly to music. The counselor ignores Jackson's behavior and continues to review. Jackson continues to listen and sing to his music loudly. Is there a discipline problem here? If so, who's exhibiting the problem? And what, if any, is the disruptive behavior? Well, a suggestive response, both the counselor and Jackson are the problem. Jackson's behavior interferes with others' students' learning, and by ignoring his behavior, the counselor is allowing Jackson to interfere with the other's right to learn. And also the counselor is not doing any teaching. So both people are the discipline problems here. Let's look at the final scenario. Okay, so Jackson still has his earphones and he's singing loudly to his music. The counselor makes eye contact with Jackson, but Jackson continues to listen and sing to his music. Next, the counselor walks up to Jackson and as privately as possible, assertively asks Jackson to please put his phone away and get out his resume. Is there a discipline problem here? If so, who's exhibiting it? And what, if any, is the disruptive behavior? And a suggested response is Jackson is the problem. The counselor chose behaviors that would draw as little attention as possible to Jackson. The counselor's behaviors would most likely increase the likelihood that Jackson will stop and get back on task. Well, okay. So when there is a discipline problem, it's important to be, it's important that we are able to identify discipline problems and identify when there really is not a discipline problem. And then if there is a discipline problem, it needs to somehow be resolved. And here is sort of a 4-step model that will allow us a pretty simple way to go about in a systematic way of trying to resolve a discipline problem. It has to be a conversation between the supervisor or the teacher or the counselor and the person who's presenting the discipline problem. There has to be a conversation, and so good conversational strategies come into play, and certainly active listening and things like that. The first thing is to define the issue. What exactly is the issue here? And it needs to be, between the two parties involved, a frank, open, transparent conversation, active listening skills, appropriate feedback, and appropriate sharing to define what exactly is going on here. Second, we need to explore the needs and concerns that are being blocked or that are causing the problem. What are the needs that are not being met? What are your concerns? What are my concerns? Third is to examine the options. How can we resolve this? What can we do to make things different? How can we make this situation right? And the last is then to put into effect an action plan. Okay, we've decided we're going to do this. So what are the steps? What am I going to be responsible for? What are you going to be responsible for? When should we meet, or should we meet again to check our progress and to see how we're going and to check in with each other? So again, this is just a simple actually it's pretty common sense, a simple 4-step model for working through a discipline issue. One is to define the issue, figure out exactly what it is, and explore what needs are being blocked or what concerns, or what's going on between us. Then to sort of brainstorm some solutions, and then finally to put a plan into effect, to talk about next steps, who's going to be responsible for this, who's responsible for that, how are we going to be able to check. Again, very simple model for looking at discipline issues. Okay, so we've looked at discipline issues, which is a technique that comes under the the interaction of inner and external forces in terms of philosophical positions, and we don't have to get too wacky or crazy about that. The next conflict resolution strategy or tool we're going to look at is called spheres of influence. It's a pretty spiffy little tool. I've used this a lot. Many times a conflict or argument may develop between a client and a supervisor, a teacher and a student, a counselor and a client, where the issue is beyond the sphere of influence of the supervisor or teacher or counselor. Then the supervisor or teacher or counselor has no control over the situation, therefore there's nothing they can do about it. As an example, suppose a crew member does not want to wear their protective earplugs or the hard hat while they're out working. And you're the supervisor, and you ask the crew member, please put on their protective gear, and they say that they don't want to. It bothers them, somehow it's too hot, it doesn't fit properly, or yada, yada, yada. Well, you might have a conversation with the crew member then that wearing the safety equipment is not your rule. You didn't make up this rule. The rule is actually a Conservation Corps, North Bay, organizational rule, and that although you didn't make the rule, as a supervisor, it's your job to have to carry it out. You have to carry out the rule. You might suggest to the Corps member, what you need to do is you need to go back to the office when we get back, and you need to talk whoever is in charge, and you need to talk to them about that rule, because this is an organization rule. I have no control over that. I just need to go along with what the organization said. A classic one when I was teaching was smoking. A student went, well, how come I can't smoke? I said, well, wait a minute. This is not a classroom rule. I didn't make this rule about smoking. And in fact, it's not even a school rule. The principal didn't make the rule about smoking, so you can't go to the principal and talk about it. And in fact, it's not even a district rule. You can't even go to the district because the district didn't make the rule. This rule is the state. This is a state rule. You'd have to go to the legislatures of the state to argue this case. I have no control over this situation. So many times, it may be just a matter of focusing, cognitively refocusing the person to see just what the spheres of influence and what you have control over and what you don't, and where they could go if it's an organization rule or a district rule or a state rule, where they would have to go. Very simple technique, very, very effective technique. Okay. So that's spheres of influence. So we've looked at discipline issues, spheres of influence. And the final one we're going to look at is what is referred to as I messages or I statements. And I'm assuming you may even be familiar with this. Okay, I statements or I messages usually contain 4 elements. A description of a behavior that actually happened, how that you feel about that behavior and its effects on you, the actual concrete, tangible effects of the behavior, and the behavior you would prefer. And they usually take this following format, although the order may vary. So let's consider this scenario. On several occasions, your friend has canceled plans at the last minute. Last night, you were waiting for her at a pizza parlor when she called to tell you she would not be able to make it because she neglected to complete a work-related report, and it is due tomorrow. So you're left there hanging, and you leave the pizza parlor, and you're feeling hurt. The next morning, you run into her at work, and you decide to bring up the issue about last night, but you don't want to sound negative. Pardon me. You decide to use an I message or I statement. So when I tell you to, I want you to put the video on pause and go to pages 8 and 9 on your worksheet and complete scenarios 1, 2, and 3. Now this is scenario 1, and then there will be 2 more scenarios. Complete those. What you'll do is you'll respond with an I message. When you have completed just those 3 on pages 8 and 9, turn the video back on and we'll look at some suggested responses. Okay, go ahead, turn it off. Okay, good. Well, I'm assuming now you have responded to those first 3 scenarios with writing I messages. Here's just an example of how we might respond to the first one. This is number 1. When we have a plan and you cancel it at the last minute, so that's describing what happened, it hurts my feelings, and that's describing the feeling, and it makes me feel as if I really don't matter. What I really would like is when you make a plan to get together, we double check to make sure that we don't have anything coming up so we don't mess it up. Now, that's just a suggested I message. Yours probably would be very different, which is great, but you get the idea. And the value of an I message is it's not blaming the other person. It's not you did this or you did that or that. It's you're talking about yourself and how the particular behavior affected you and what you would like instead of that behavior. Well, let's look at scenario number 2. This scenario, you're working on a project out in the field with your work crew, and one member is not completing their tasks. You have repeatedly had to finish their work, and this is very frustrating. The next morning, you run into him at work. You decide to bring up the issue, but again, you don't want to sound negative. So you decide to use an I message or an I statement. Okay, here's my suggested response. Again, it's just a suggested response. When we are out working and you don't participate and complete your job, it puts extra pressure on me and the rest of the crew. Okay, so that's talking about what the person actually did and how it affects you and how it makes you feel. I feel very frustrated by this and feel that it is unfair to me and to others. What I really would like is if you would complete your assigned work. If you need assistance, please ask. I'd be more than glad to help if I can. Again, another example of an I message. You're not really casting a lot of blame, like, oh, you're no good, or you're lazy, or this or that. You're just explaining to the person how their behavior affects you, in what ways it affects you, and what you would really like to have happen. Let's take a look at the third one. A friend who borrows movies from you usually brings them back late or damaged. They want to borrow one again, but you're feeling a little conflicted. She called you to borrow another movie. While on the phone, you decide to bring up the issue, but you don't want to sound negative. You decide again to use an iMessage. And here's a suggested iMessage. In the past, when you have borrowed a movie, sometimes you have returned it late, and one time the movie was damaged. So that's just describing the situation. This hurts my feelings and makes me think you have no respect for my things. What I would like is if you took better care of my movies and returned them on time. Then I'd be glad to lend them to you anytime. Again, iMessage, not really casting blame, not you this, you that, you this, you that, just talking about how it affects you and what you would like the new behavior to look like. Well, okay. Now it's your turn to create two scenarios. So I want you to think of two workplace-related scenarios where a coworker or client has done something that affected you or bothered you. And then I want you to put the video on pause when I tell you to, and go to page, I'm looking right now, I think it's page 9. Yes, go to page 9, and you have two, since there are two situations, you have situation 1, and I want you to describe the situation, and then under that it says iMessage, then I want you to write your iMessage how you would respond to it. And you have situation number 2, and I want you to describe the situation and then write the iMessage. That's all on page 9. So please put the video on pause. When you're done completing that, please turn the video back on again. Go ahead, put it on pause. Well, okay, good. Well, here are tools now that we have covered so far in these modules. We've talked about under the relationship listening or internal, we've talked about iMessages, spheres of influence, active listening skills like paraphrasing, non-direct talk, critical listening skills, the use of silence. We've also talked about discipline issues in this module. So we're filling in our toolbox. And as we go along, we will continue to add tools that exist here, until eventually we'll cover almost all of the tools available to us in working with individuals. I want to thank you very much. If you would, please go to page 10, and that asks you for a little feedback about this module. And again, thank you, and we'll see you in the next module.